Throughout the 19th century, New York City became the largest source of oysters worldwide. On any day in the late 19th century, 6 million oysters can be found on the barges tied up along the city's waterfront.
New York Harbor was once blanketed by 220,000 acres of oyster reefs.
The harbor used to have one of the largest sources of oyster reefs in the world. But overfishing, disease, and poor water quality killed and damaged much of the oyster beds that lived in the waters around Manhattan.
They fed a city, built its shoreline, and filtered its water until pollution and overharvest wiped them out.
But just think, what would happen if you put 1 billion of these into this?
That's exactly what the folks at the New York Harbor School, located on Governor's Island, are trying to do with the Billion Oyster Project.
By 1927, the harbor was nearly lifeless. Then, 10 years ago, a few visionaries started tossing baby oysters and restaurant shells into toxic waters. Most called it foolish. Now, over 130 million oysters thrive where none should. But this isn't a feel-good comeback story. The water didn't surrender easily. So, how did a lost ecosystem spark one of the boldest restoration bets in modern history? Let's dive in. Visionaries versus the harbor. It started with a pile of old restaurant shells, a few skeptical students, and a seemingly absurd idea: put oysters back into one of the dirtiest harbors in America. In 2014, on the shores of Governor's Island, a group of teenagers from the New York Harbor School began hauling buckets of discarded oyster shells across curing yards, open-air lots where sunlight and rain would bleach them clean. The project was called the Billion Oyster Project. Its goal? To restore 1 billion oysters to New York Harbor by hand, by boat, and by belief. Its founders, Pete Malinowski and Murray Fisher, weren't just rebuilding reefs. They were testing a theory that the harbor, long seen as toxic and beyond repair, still held the memory of what it once was. And maybe, just maybe, it could come back to life. But restoring oysters in polluted water meant working against a century of decline, public doubt, and bureaucratic red tape. Every reef needed permits, monitoring, and constant oversight. Even the oysters themselves had to carry warning signs. Do not eat. This wasn't just science, it was defiance. A slow, muddy, methodical rebellion against the idea that once an ecosystem is broken, it stays that way. And it all began with shells that used to be trash. Collapse of a living engine. Long before the first skyscraper cast a shadow over Manhattan, New York Harbor was alive with motion and sound. Beneath the waves, oyster reefs sprawled across 220,000 acres, an underwater metropolis so dense that Dutch ships had to navigate around them to avoid running aground. For the Lenape people, these reefs were life itself: food, trade, tools, and tradition. When European settlers arrived, they saw something else: profit. Oysters became the city's defining delicacy. By the 1800s, New York was the oyster capital of the world. Street vendors sold them by the bucket. Taverns served them to bankers and dock workers alike. Their discarded shells even built the shoreline, turning piles of waste into new land. But abundance bred appetite, and appetite, unchecked, breeds collapse. As the city grew, so did the pressure. Harvesters scraped reefs flat. Factories poured chemicals into the estuary. Raw sewage flowed freely from combined sewer overflows. Pipes that dumped everything from rainwater to human waste straight into the harbor. By 1927, the last commercial oyster beds were shut down. The waters that once nurtured a global shellfish trade were now choked with pollution. Health officials declared oysters unsafe to eat. The reefs vanished. So did the fish, the birds, the eelgrass, and the memories. For nearly half a century, the harbor was dismissed as a dead zone, a graveyard for what once was. The city looked away, but the water, and what it could still become, was not entirely lost. Law, larvae, and labor. In 1972, the United States passed a law that would quietly change the fate of New York Harbor, the Clean Water Act. For the first time, it became illegal to dump untreated sewage into waterways. Across the country, cities were forced to reckon with the mess they had made. New York began upgrading wastewater treatment plants, tracking contamination, and laying the groundwork for a slow recovery. It wasn't instant, it wasn't pretty, but it was the beginning. Decades later, on a forgotten piling or a crumbling seawall, biologists noticed something astonishing. A few wild oysters had returned, small, scattered, barely holding on. But they were there, survivors. That's when the Billion Oyster Project stepped in. The team didn't wait for clean water. They built a new life in the middle of uncertainty. Volunteers collected thousands of pounds of used oyster shells from Manhattan and Brooklyn restaurants. These shells, once bound for landfills, were cleaned, dried, and seeded with oyster larvae bred at the harbor school's hatchery. The spat, as they're called, cemented themselves to the shells and grew. Slowly, quietly, the harbor began to breathe again. Students waded into cold water to check cages. They fixed broken pumps, logged every shell, monitored survival rates. It wasn't glamorous, but it was exacting. Restoration done one oyster at a time by people who believed a dead harbor didn't have to stay dead. Even regulators couldn't look away. Underwater cameras, RFID, radio frequency identification, tags, and strict no-harvest rules turned the project from a science fair curiosity into a credible experiment in ecological engineering. From restaurant trash to reef, this was urban restoration rewritten. Rebuilding the reef. Beneath the surface of the Hudson River, a new kind of city was rising. One not built of steel and glass, but of shells, wire, and life. The Billion Oyster Project deployed its first major test at Hudson River Park. Reef balls and gabion cages, seeded with millions of oyster spat, were lowered into the currents. These structures mimicked the cracks and crevices of natural reefs. Within months, they began attracting company. Blue crabs, oyster toadfish, mud snails, and swarms of translucent shrimp darting between shell clusters. By year 3, Marine Survey teams counted more than 35 different species around the restored reefs. Biodiversity wasn't just returning, it was multiplying. The harbor, long considered sterile, was stirring. And then came a shock. At Tappan Zee, project scientists decided to try something risky. No hatchery larvae, no human seeding, just bare shell and rock. If nature had any memory left, it would have to show itself. It did. Over the next few seasons, wild oyster larvae found the site on their own. When biologists tallied the results, they found 5.8 million wild oysters thriving in a place thought incapable of sustaining natural recruitment. It was a biological turning point. Nature, once given a foothold, didn't just return, it surged. The reefs weren't only rebuilding oyster populations, they were reactivating an entire web of marine life. And students, some of whom had never been on a boat before, were recording it all, clipboards in hand, helping capture one of the most unexpected urban ecological revivals in modern history. From the mud, a forgotten ecosystem was learning how to breathe again. Oysters versus climate change. For years, the oyster comeback was framed as ecological redemption, a triumph of habitat over history. But the real twist came when researchers realized oysters weren't just cleaning water and boosting biodiversity. They were doing something even more urgent. They were protecting the city. In 2021, a joint study by the University of Chicago and the Nature Conservancy uncovered a staggering fact. Oyster reefs can reduce wave energy by up to 76%. These layered living structures act as natural breakwaters, blunting storm surges and slowing erosion, sometimes outperforming engineered seawalls. This was no longer just restoration. It was climate adaptation. In an age of rising seas, stronger hurricanes, and disappearing coastlines, New York's humble oyster beds had become a line of defense. Not a metaphorical one, a physical one. And unlike concrete barriers, oyster reefs evolve. They grow, adapt, and self-repair. They create shelter as they fortify. They don't just block destruction, they nurture life in the process. Design teams began incorporating this potential into their reef strategies. Structures were optimized not only for oyster attachment, but for wave dampening. Some reefs were strategically placed along vulnerable marsh edges, where their presence helped stabilize soft, retreating shorelines. Suddenly, the stakes had changed. Oysters weren't just about remembering the past. They were about preparing for the future. What began as a bet on biology had become a hedge against climate disaster, a living infrastructure powered by shell, salt, and time. What the reefs can't fix. For all their resilience, oysters can't solve everything. Every time a heavy rain hits New York, the city's century-old sewer system releases untreated waste into the harbor. These combined sewer overflows, still legal during storms, mean the waters remain officially off-limits for harvesting. Even the healthiest oysters, filtering up to 50 gallons a day, can't overcome raw sewage. Then there's disease. Pathogens like dermo and MSX, multinucleated sphere X, common up and down the East Coast, can wipe out entire oyster populations in a matter of weeks. Marine pathologists at local labs monitor each reef closely, constantly adjusting broodstock to outpace the next outbreak. And climate change cuts both ways. While oyster reefs protect coastlines, rising temperatures and salinity swings can devastate young spat before they ever anchor. In recent years, dock failures and heat waves have triggered mass die-offs, forcing engineers to redesign reef structures and deploy oysters at deeper, cooler depths. Despite more than 130 million oysters seeded, the reefs can't replace the city's $45 billion wastewater infrastructure overhaul. They're allies, not substitutes, in the battle to revive the harbor. Nature, it turns out, still needs our help. They nearly vanished from memory, life forms no bigger than a thumb, once written off with the tides. But oysters didn't just come back. They built walls, calmed storms, and proved resilience is something you can grow by hand. Could your city use an army of oysters? Let us know what you think in the comments. And if this story made you see the harbor differently, consider sharing it.